Okay, good morning, everyone. Today is September 17th. Let's go ahead and get started. I am on the wrong slide here. Hang on. I'm on the wrong set of slides. Okay, when we left off, we were talking about the Ottoman Empire, a very large European and Asian empire that was dominated by the Turks that collapsed after the end of World War I. And even though this empire may seem like it was a long time ago and not particularly relevant, the truth is the Ottoman Empire is still very relevant, primarily because the modern Middle East comes out of its dissolution. The modern borders of today's Middle Eastern nations, Eastern European nations, etc., they are all a result of the dissolution of the empire, the borders that were drawn by outsiders. This has played a big role all the way up to the present. And of course, to be honest with you, the decline of the empire played a big role in the start of World War I to begin with, because it was these newly independent states that started causing issues that led to that conflict. So the Ottoman Empire is still very much relevant to the present day. Now, also, though, if you go to present-day Turkey, or for that matter, the ancillary states of the Ottoman Empire, like those of the Middle East, they don't look back on the empire necessarily as something they would want to bring back or with nostalgia or anything along those lines. They're perfectly happy to have the empire gone and the modern states here. Nevertheless, we have to understand this. We have to understand this. And what frustrated me about this is that when I was in college myself and I was taking World Civ classes, the Ottoman Empire almost never got discussed. And I remember looking at these maps, and there's this huge empire here, and my teachers never even brought it up. And I'm thinking to myself, this is relevant. So I like to talk about it a bit. And of course, we had moved into China, if I'm not mistaken, correct? We had also discussed China, and we were talking about the fact that one aspect of Chinese history that we have to always keep in mind is that there is an awful lot of it. China has been around a very, very long time. Historians divide China into a series of dynasties, and each one of these dynasties could have lasted many, many generations. And so there's no possible way we could cover the breadth of Chinese history, even the breadth of modern Chinese history, in the time that we have. What we do want to talk about, sort of, is a little bit into the Chinese worldview, which gives us a better understanding into how China developed into the modern era. One powerful philosophy that has been a part of China for a very long time is Confucianism. We have all heard of Confucius, the ancient philosopher. Obviously, we're not going to go into him a whole lot, but what we need to know is that Confucius lived in the 6th century BC. The 6th century BC. So he is well before the modern era. He is millennia before the modern era. His writings are recorded in a series of works known as the Analects. His writings are recorded in a series of works known as the Analects.
What date did you say?
The 6th century BC. And what he reflects is the idea that a good life is one that is balanced. If we look at just the general message that Confucius puts out there, what we need to live is a balanced life. If you say to yourself, I want to live a happy life, well, that's not going to work, because you're going to have just as much sadness as you're going to have happiness. I don't care who you are, I don't care how you live, I don't care when you live or where you live, you're going to have sad and you're going to have happy, aren't you? You're going to have good times and you're going to have bad times. You're going to have sickness and you're going to have health. Every single human being experiences all of that. And so what Confucius would argue is that the best way to live your life is to look for a way to balance the good and the bad. This means that you have to take active choices, active steps to do what you're supposed to do when you're supposed to do it. When it is time to work, you need to go work. And when you do work, you need to work hard and put effort into whatever task you're accomplishing. And then when it's time to rest, you need to go rest. When it's time to enjoy a good meal, you got to eat your vegetables, and you also get to eat the dessert, don't you? But if all you do is eat dessert, it ain't going to be good, right? If you refuse to work and all you want to do is rest, it's not going to work out. If you don't balance your life, things don't work out very well. And this idea of balance permeates the Chinese worldview. This is how the Chinese people often think of the world. There are two forces that are frequently brought up in East Asian culture, and they are the yin and the yang. And the idea behind these isn't that they represent good and evil, or that they represent right and wrong, or that they represent light and dark. They just sort of represent all of that. That most of the experiences that we have or what we encounter has kind of two sides to it. Yes, there is a time we're awake and a time we're asleep. Yes, there's a time we're happy and a time we're sad. Yes, there's a time at day and there's a time at night. There's a balance that the universe always sort of throws out there. And these opposite forces, one way or another, always balance themselves out. And so that's sort of the concept of the yin and the yang. And Confucius talks about this. This is not that different from the ancient Greek philosophy, Greco-Roman philosophy of Epicureanism. Epicurus was a philosopher that came after Alexander the Great, and he argued a lot of the same principles. He also argued, balance your life. Work when you're supposed to work, rest when you're supposed to rest, seek to accomplish your tasks, but don't overdo it. Enjoy a nice dinner, but eat your vegetables. Enjoy a glass of wine. Don't drink the whole bottle. You get the idea. And if you live a balanced life like that, you're going to do about as good as any of us can do. Confucius called this the middle path. Confucius called this the middle path. He also argued that we should not focus all that much on, collectively speaking, the spirit world. Our ancestors or the gods or the spirits, that's to Confucius, they live in their world and we live in ours. And so we'll be there soon enough. What we need to focus on is the world we live in. Now, there is another philosophy that comes along. I believe we mentioned this one. And this is going to become also very large, not just in China, but throughout East Asia and South Asia. And this is Buddhism. Now, Buddha was actually a fellow by the name of Gautama Siddhartha, and he was Indian. Buddhism is not so much a religion as it is a philosophy. You can be a Buddhist and practice whatever religion you want. The principles of Buddhism are actually what matter. The principles of Buddhism are what matter. And what Buddha, as they call him, began to assert is that unhappiness, stress, is caused by the constant desire for more. It is this constant human urge of greed and desire that actually makes us unhappy. And finding a way to live a balanced life means learning to control these urges. And I think the example that I gave last time, and it's probably the best I can think of, is the way kids are when Christmas is coming, right? Again, I want an Xbox, I want an Xbox, I want an Xbox. You bug your parents day and night, and you know you did that, right? For the Xbox or whatever the heck it was. And so they finally gave in, and, Santa Claus put it under the Christmas tree, and then a week later you're bored with it, right? And you want something else. I don't want an Xbox anymore. I want an Xbox One, right? And then I want an Xbox One X. It was always something else. It's always something else. And so what Buddha figured out is that actually getting that item, getting that thing that you wanted isn't really going to make you happy. All that does is give you a temporary feeling of relief, like a drug, and then the drug wears off and you have to have something else. And so if you're a drug addict, you're not going to fix yourself by taking more drugs, are you? What you got to do is you got to quit thinking that way. You just have to quit wanting it. You have to say to yourself, my life is good, I don't need it. My life is good, I don't need it. And that's a really, really tough one. That's a really, really tough one. Because as we move into the modern era, we are surrounded by a constant push to want all that stuff, don't we? The argument today is that we have turned into a world where all we think about is, what do I want for me, right? What do I want for me? And people are going out spending money they don't have on things they don't need because I got to have this stuff. Now, if we want to get into the biology of it, what an endocrinologist would tell you is that by going out and getting the Xbox, what you're really doing is giving yourself what they call an endorphin rush. What are endorphins? Y'all have taken biology classes. What are endorphins? And so, yeah, dopamine. Dopamine's a good example. They're feel-good drugs, right? And when you get a jolt of these feel-good drugs, you feel good for a little bit, and then you go back down again and you want more, right? We know about shopaholics, people that go out and spend money, right? And they'll go out and they'll buy junk they don't need. Well, what they're doing is the spending of the money makes them feel good, right? And so they go out and they spend money and it feels good, but then immediately those endorphins wear off and then they got to go out and do more, right? Same with people who, constantly get one thing after another. They got to get another one in order to feel good. The modern capitalist architecture, marketing, is designed to give you endorphin rushes, isn't it? Every TV commercial, right? Every ad you see, go out and if you buy this, if you give us your money, you'll feel good. And Buddha would say, just don't want any of it. Get rid of all of that desire. It's not going to make you happy. None of it will make you happy. Stop wanting it. And the minute you do that is the minute you feel fine. Do you think we're addicted to that stuff? How many pairs of sneakers do y'all have? More than you need, right? How many coats do you have? More than you need, right? How many people go out and buy a new car even though the car they have is perfectly fine, right? You see where I'm coming from, right? So Buddha would say, stop doing that. He would say, stop it. Not going to make you happy. And what other people think of you doesn't matter. Now, why is this important? Well, what it demonstrates is that the Chinese have a different way of looking at the world than the West. They're different people. It's a different culture. Let's move up to the modern era. Let's move up to the modern era. In the 14th century, specifically 1368, 1369, a new dynasty emerges in China known as the Ming Dynasty. And scholars generally consider the Ming Dynasty a high point in Chinese culture. During the Ming Dynasty, China was prosperous, China was powerful, China was doing very, very well. And one characteristic of the Ming Dynasty is the artisanship that came from China during this time. China was a center of outstanding skilled production. People talk about how Ming vases are worth a lot of money. They're not talking about Ming as a specific person. They're talking about vases that come from the Ming era. And yes, the pottery and things like that were created during the Ming Dynasty tend to be very, very high quality. If you look at these here, they look like they could have been created yesterday. These are hundreds of years old, and the art, just the artistic quality of them is outstanding. China was a very, very affluent place. And again, what this tells us is there was an upper class that could pay for this. What this tells us is there was stability, there was order, there was trade, there was commerce. People could put years and years into developing the level of skill to create something like this. And that gives us a good insight into how good things were for the Chinese people. Here is some Chinese script during that era. The Chinese language itself is, of course, a written language. It is highly complex. There are hundreds of different symbols that mean hundreds of different words, and Chinese is read up to down. It isn't read left to right. More modern versions of the Chinese script have been simplified because it's just not possible to type, hundreds of symbols, that sort of thing. And so there are more standardized versions that have reduced a lot of the symbols and a lot of the letters. But what we need to know is that Chinese script is far more complex than Western script. Now, with all of this in mind, Chinese culture developed, I guess, what we would consider a bit of a fatal flaw. Certainly it developed a culture that did not help it moving forward. You see, the Chinese understood that they were highly advanced. They understood that their culture was very successful. And like a lot of cultures that tend to be doing very well, they began to look inward rather than outward. Simply put, they did not want to involve themselves with the outside world. Much like the ancient Greeks, the Chinese started to view non-Chinese as barbaric. They started to view non-Chinese as people that were not so good. We don't want to interact with these people. We don't want to involve ourselves with these people. They are less than us. And again, if you were to go through China in the 14th and 15th century and maybe go to other parts of the world, you would probably agree. China is doing extremely well. The Chinese people are wearing perfume and silk robes, and the European people are still, throwing mud at each other. There's a difference. There's a difference. During the early and mid 15th century, in other words, the 1400s, a series of Chinese expeditions explored vast areas of the globe. Chinese explorers set off largely in the southern hemisphere, the Indian Ocean. Here's one of the big expeditions here. They were led by a fellow named Xing He, who, as I understand, was Muslim, actually. But this expedition, in very, very large, very well-built ships, navigated all through South Asia, all through the Indian Ocean. They went to Africa, they went to the Middle East, they went to India, many different ports, interacted with many different people. They then went back home to China, and the Ming Emperor ordered all of the ships burned, all of the records destroyed, and prohibited any more exploration. And you would think to yourself, this is decades before Columbus, and the Chinese are already able to navigate on the blue water. The Chinese could have created a colonial empire, much like the Europeans will do a couple of generations later. Why do you think the Ming Emperor said, no, we're not doing any of that? We're destroying the ships. I want to make sure that not only do we not do it, but we are not capable of doing it. He was so adamant that this not happen. Why do you think it would be that way? Can anybody think of what would possess the leadership to think like that? It gets back down to what we mentioned earlier. The Chinese did not want to open the door for these other, what they considered barbaric people to enter China. They looked inward rather than outward. Y'all have heard of the Great Wall of China? Well, they were putting one up around their culture. They were putting up one around their culture. What is the term used when a culture is bigoted to the point where they do not want to have anything to do with other people? What is the term used when somebody thinks that way or a culture thinks that way? What's it called? It's called xenophobia. It's called xenophobia. Anybody who's different from me, stay away. I want nothing to do with you. Xenophobia. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this was a flaw. This was a problem. This was not good. Because what it meant is that just a few decades earlier, the Europeans are going to develop the same technology that the Chinese had. The Europeans are going to explore the world. The Europeans are going to create colonial empires, trading networks, etc. And of course, that means European technology continues to move forward, European power continues to move forward, and China basically remains stuck in the Middle Ages. China was living in the 14th century and the 15th century. A few hundred years later, China is still living in the 14th and 15th century. China has not moved forward, but yet Europe has. And so once it became impossible for China to ignore the rest of the world, China was at a very significant disadvantage. China was dealing with early technology when the Europeans showed up with steamships and cannons, and you can figure out where that's going to go, right? The first real interaction with the outside world, and rest assured the Chinese did not necessarily want this, came in 1514 when Portuguese explorers showed up. Much like the Portuguese were going to explore Brazil and South Asia, of course, they showed up in China. And these Portuguese are interested in trade. These Portuguese are interested in doing business. And the Chinese government resisted this. It isn't that they cut the Portuguese off entirely. They were smart enough to know we can't just completely ignore these people. There was even a little bit of Christian conversion. Some Chinese people even converted to Christianity because, of course, everywhere the Spanish and Portuguese went, that happened. The Ming Empire fell in 1644. The Ming Empire fell in 1644. And the new emperor, the new imperial system, came from the north. It came from a region we call Manchuria. And we will call this new dynasty the Qing dynasty. Sometimes it's called the Manchu dynasty. But the Qing dynasty is the new governance structure. Here is one of the Ming emperors. I believe this is Kangxi or someone like that. He's doing a pretty good job of, being Chinese, right? Being the emperor. The Manchurians kept up the policy of trying to keep the outside world out. They are an example of the fact that not all, that China is itself sort of internally diverse. There are different Chinese identities. As a matter of fact, many Chinese don't even consider the Manchurians Chinese. If you talk to some, depending on how you look at it, they consider the Manchurians kind of an other people as well. But they were up in the north. And throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, for lack of a better description, China simply did not develop. It did not go out in the world. It did not embrace new technology. They are still living the same way they did generations earlier. In 1796, we started to see very real cracks within the Manchurian leadership. There was a rebellion that took place for about 8 years. There was a rebellion that took place for about 8 years. It was a rural peasant rebellion known as the White Lotus Rebellion. Starting in about the year 1800, European nations began to involve themselves in China, whether the Chinese wanted them to or not. And again, the European nations by this point have gunships, cannons, howitzers. You get the idea. And of course, the Chinese don't. And so when European merchants start showing up and trading and doing business on their terms, there's not a whole lot the Chinese can do about it. One of the biggest companies to do this was the British East India Company. And it had been around in China for a little while, but it started to have a huge presence beginning about 1800. Tea, of course, was a big item that was traded. And throughout the 19th century, we see the authority of the central government began to rapidly deteriorate. The emperor's power over the nation is weakening. Regional warlords and regional noblemen take more and more power. Many of them are now doing business with the Westerners and becoming wealthy themselves. And one product started being imported into China, which absolutely devastated the population, particularly the coastal population. And who can tell me what that product is? Here's a hint. The British were importing it from India. Opium. The British started importing opium into Chinese ports. Now, of course, opium had already been in China, but the British started becoming drug dealers, for lack of a better description. They're growing lots of opium in India. They're then moving into Chinese ports, and they're selling it to the Chinese people. Opium is a terribly addictive drug. It is a narcotic, of course. And I'll clarify what this actually is right now since we have a minute. Opium comes from the poppy plant. Opium comes from the poppy plant, and there are a series of different opiates within opium itself. Opium is kind of a mix of a variety of substances, and they all basically do the same thing to you. They get you really, really high, and it's also extremely addictive. Opium can be eaten, opium can be smoked, which is generally what was done in China. What are some versions of opiates, substances that are derived from opium that, of course, we should all be familiar with in one way or another? How about heroin, right? How about heroin? How about morphine? Hydrocodone, Vicodin, Lortab, those are all different, oxycodone, those are all versions of opiates. And when you mix them all together into one big substance, it becomes opium. And so that's what's really going on there. And just in case you're wondering, morphine and heroin are actually the same thing. When you put morphine into your body, it immediately turns, when you put heroin into your body, it immediately turns into morphine. And so when you go to the doctor and you're in a lot of pain and he gives you a morphine shot, what he's actually giving you is a heroin shot, in case y'all are wondering. We just use different words for it. And this stuff is really, really bad to mess around with. The problem is we don't have any other painkillers that work. That's the problem. There are no other painkillers that we have derived yet. And now there are synthetic opiates, which are vastly more powerful than heroin is. What's the synthetic opiate that's causing all kinds of problems today? And it's actually legal. You can get it legally for pain, but the street version is far, far worse. It's called fentanyl. Who in here's heard of fentanyl? Yeah, y'all have heard of fentanyl. Fentanyl is just a super duper powerful version of heroin. That's all it is. Fentanyl is in fact so powerful that an amount of fentanyl equivalent to 2 grains of salt is enough to kill most people. You will overdose and die on 2 grains of salt worth of fentanyl. And so you can understand why getting this stuff out on the street is a really, really bad thing, because drug addicts don't measure things very well. And so this is bad. This is bad. Anyway, back to opium in China. The British figured out very quickly this is crazy profitable, because once we get these Chinese people hooked on opium, that's all they do. They keep buying it. There were wars fought between China and Britain during the 19th century. We'll talk about that a little bit later. In both cases, Britain won, and both of these wars were fought over opium. Specifically, the Chinese government was trying to stop the British from importing it. The Chinese government felt it had no other choice but to try to use its military to stop the importation of opium. And in both cases, the British won handily, and the British took the port of Hong Kong, which was the biggest port in China, as a colony to punish China for fighting the Opium Wars. Around the year 1900, there was a revolt in China against Western influence. Around the year 1900, there was a revolt in China against Western influence. This was known as the Boxer Rebellion. And this was a rebellion of Chinese people trying to drive out Westerners. They were sick of Westerners showing up and causing problems in their country. And they wanted them gone. Didn't work though. The Boxer Rebellion was put down. And in 1912, the Qing dynasty collapsed. The last emperor, who was just a little boy, was kicked off the throne, and China has not had an emperor since. The Chinese Empire is now history. And throughout the 20th century, China has gone through a series of different governments. There was a lot of turmoil in the first few decades, of course. After the imperial collapse, things did not get better, they got worse. And then in World War II, of course, was a problem. Modern China seems to be recovering, but we'll get into that later. And with that in mind, we need to talk about China's neighbor, Japan. We need to talk about China's neighbor, Japan. Now, Japan also, of course, is an ancient culture, but compared to China, Japan is relatively young. You know, Japan does not go back nearly as far as China does. Japan is a series of islands. Japan is a series of islands. And these islands were initially colonized by Koreans. And so the Japanese people actually have their genetic history in Korea. The spiritual founder of Japan is this fella here, Shotoku Taishi, who lived in the 6th and 7th centuries AD. And so, China was already thousands of years old by the time we see modern Japan, or we see Japan emerge. I wouldn't call it modern Japan. Now, whether or not Shotoku Taishi was a real person is actually subject to debate. Nobody really knows for sure. He is more of a mythical figure. Much of his life is sort of shrouded in mystery, but nevertheless, what we need to know is that in the year 710, there was a clear Japanese nation, a clear Japanese state, and the capital was Kyoto. The capital was Kyoto. And Kyoto is still the spiritual capital of Japan. And by the way, the Japanese don't call themselves Japanese. Japan is not Japan. To them, it is Nippon. We have our own pronunciation of it. But that's how they view their country. That's their title. Now, how did Japan work? Well, Japan will have an emperor. Japan will have an emperor, much like China, of course. And much like China, the Japanese emperor is a very, very significant person. To the Japanese, the emperor is godlike. He is so important that ordinary people are not even allowed to look at him. He is so important that he does not involve himself in the day-to-day affairs of Japan. He is a spiritual figure, so to speak. And that was true of the Chinese emperor as well, by the way. Ordinary people cannot even look at the emperor. It's considered inappropriate to even say his name. He is simply the emperor or his majesty. You don't call him by his name. You don't refer to him by his name. Generally speaking, Japan was ruled by warlords. The emperor, as we mentioned, does not involve himself in day-to-day affairs. Here is Japanese art from a long time ago, and you can see there's a picture of horses, and then they've written on it. Japanese script is very similar to Chinese. It came from Chinese script, although today it is distinct. But Japanese script has its roots in Chinese. In the 12th century, here's another interesting piece of art. In the 12th century, a new leader emerged. He was not emperor. A new leader emerged named Yoritomo. A new leader emerged, Yoritomo. not an emperor. And Yoritomo created a new type of government known as the shogunate. Yoritomo created a new type of government, the shogunate. Under the shogunate, Japan is ruled by regional warlords, and the emperor is now officially a figurehead. The emperor is now officially a figurehead. And he isn't a figurehead because we are minimizing him. He is a figurehead because he is too important to be concerned with governing this country. This is above, he is above all of this. The nobility under the shogunate are known as the samurai. Much like feudal knights in Europe, the samurai are warrior noblemen. The samurai are warrior noblemen. Here are some Japanese emperors. Here are samurai. And samurai are expected to live by what is known as the Bushido Code. Samurai are expected to live by the Bushido Code, much like the code of chivalry that feudal knights in Europe would have lived by. You must be honorable, you must be brave, you must follow orders and show respect and all of that. You get the idea. Now, the Japanese also developed a culture that was prosperous, that was affluent, that was stable. If you were to be thrust back in time and had to kind of pick where you'd want to live, picking Japan during this era would not be a bad choice, given the options. And so much like the Chinese, the Japanese looked inward. They were not interested in having anything to do with these outside people. To the Japanese, outsiders were ugly barbarians that looked funny and smelled worse. They don't want to involve themselves with the outside world. Just leave us alone. We're doing fine. And Japan is not very multi-ethnic. The Japanese are very, very homogenous in terms of their ethnic identity. This is not a diverse place at all. Japan has a lot of mountains, which means that there isn't a lot of good arable farmland in Japan. Yes, they are very, very good at growing food, but only in the select places where you can grow it. What, of course, was the primary staple of the Japanese diet? Rice, right? And the reason why the Japanese grew so much rice is you can produce a lot of rice in a very small area. It wasn't that they liked rice so much, it's just, again, a small little field can produce a heck of a lot of rice. And when you've got a lot of people to feed and not a lot of good farmland, you got to maximize your yield. Also, a huge part of the Japanese diet is, of course, fishing. These are islands that the Japanese people live on, and so they are fishermen, and they are darn good at it. Fish and rice are the two real staples of the Japanese diet all the way up to the present. All the way up to the present. And because Japan sits on the very eastern edge of Asia, and then there is this huge Pacific Ocean, when the sun comes up in the morning, Japan is the first nation that the sun shines on. If you're looking across to the east, where the sun comes up, the sun hits Japan first. And so what is Japan's nickname? It is the land of the, I'm sorry? It's the land of the rising sun, exactly. Japan is the land of the rising sun because the sun comes up over Japan before it comes up over anywhere else. And of course, what is the Japanese flag? It's a big sun, right? That's why the Japanese flag is a big red dot. That's symbolizing, we're the land of the rising sun. That's what that's all about. They're very proud of that, the Japanese people. The day always rises in Japan before it rises anywhere else. That's the way they look at it. Anyway, much like China, Europe is not going to just stay away. Europe is going to explore the world. Europe is going to try to convert people to Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. And just like in China, the Portuguese showed up in Japan as well. This was in the mid-1500s. Realizing that the Portuguese were a powerful people, the Japanese did interact with them to some extent. They allowed the Portuguese to have a small little outpost there. Some Japanese converted to Christianity, but the leadership was rather hostile to this. The Portuguese actually did give the Japanese leaders some guns. There's accounts of samurai and regional warlords interacting with guns. And of course, the minute they saw them working, they wanted more, didn't they? And so the Japanese actually started bringing guns into their military really before the Chinese did. And the Japanese, of course, very quickly had their own artisans start recreating them. But they were never as well armed as the Europeans. They were never able to get it quite together the way the Europeans did when it came to that. Eventually, Japan is going to realize that the Europeans are a threat. The Japanese, again, in preserving their culture, they want to wall them off. We're talking xenophobia here. And so much like China, Japan moves into the modern era without really advancing technically. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that Japan really opened up. The United States actually sent a fleet to force Japan to develop diplomatic relations. We had been running into problems with them in the Pacific, and so we sent a Commodore, Matthew Perry, to come over and force Japan to open up. And as a result of that, Japan decided to modernize. The Japanese leadership saw what was going on in China, saw what had happened with the Opium Wars. And so the Japanese leaders decided that it was time to get out of the Middle Ages, that it was time to become a truly modern state with a modern industry, a modern industrial base, a modern military, a modern economy, modern infrastructure, you name it. And so the system of samurai, the shogunate, was dissolved, and this is an event known as the Meiji Restoration. And it started in 1867. Meiji was an emperor. They got a new emperor in 1867, and so when he came to the throne, Japan very quickly reformed. Japan built a modern state almost in a generation. A modern army, a modern, again, industrial base, modern infrastructure, modern schools, and most definitely a modern navy. So by 1900, Japan was a much more modern state than the Western world really understood. And the whole part of that was that, we're going to get colonized if we don't do something about this. And once Japan had a modern army and a modern navy, what did Japan start doing with it? Japan started using it. And so Japan became an aggressive colonizing power once Japan saw that it had the power to do that. One of Japan's great weaknesses is the fact that Japan doesn't have many natural resources. You see, Japan used to be ocean floor. It's just limestone. And so there's no iron, there's no coal, there's no oil, there's no minerals of any kind. And so if Japan wants to have modern industry, Japan has to get it from somewhere else. And so Japan started using this powerful army and powerful navy to go into places like China and Korea and colonize them and conquer these other people for their resources. And that's what ultimately led to World War II. All right, are there any questions? Okay, why do you say we go ahead and call it a lecture then? Okay, I've got to get this uploaded. And so everybody, look, have a good weekend, stay safe, and, pray that all of those Atlantic storms just stay out in the Atlantic. Are we cool? All right, y'all take care. Have a good day.